His throne, her cage, their destiny. Alessandra Romano had never been afraid of the dark, but when her family's empire collapsed, she found herself staring into the eyes of its most dangerous enemy. Dario Benedetti sat across from her, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. "You want to survive?" he murmured. "Then you'll do exactly as I say." Chapter 1. The Fall of the Romano Empire. The chandelier, a glittering constellation of crystals, swayed slightly, its delicate light dancing across the mahogany table where Alessandra Romano sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room, once a vibrant hub of family dinners and boisterous celebrations, was now shrouded in a suffocating silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. It felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a life that was no more. Outside, the Roman rain lashed against the tall windows, mirroring the storm raging within her. Just hours ago, this house, this life, had been her sanctuary. Now, it felt like a gilded cage, the bars forged from betrayal and loss. Her father, Don Marco Romano, had always been a pillar of strength, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had built the Romano Empire from the ground up, transforming it from a humble family business into a powerful force within the city's intricate web of alliances and rivalries. Alessandra had grown up bathed in the glow of his power, sheltered from the darker undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of their opulent life. She had been the cherished daughter, the apple of his eye, groomed not for the brutal realities of their world, but for a life of elegant parties, carefully chosen suitors, and quiet, dignified motherhood. But the whispers had started weeks ago, growing louder, more insistent, like the relentless drumming of the rain outside. Whispers of a new power rising, a name that chilled the blood even of the most hardened men. Benedetti. Dario Benedetti. The name was spoken with a mixture of awe and terror, a legend woven from ruthlessness and ambition. He was a shadow, a phantom, a force that seemed to materialize from the darkness, consuming everything in his path. Alessandra had dismissed the rumors at first, clinging to the belief in her father's invincibility. He was Don Romano, after all. He had weathered storms before, navigated treacherous waters with a steady hand and an unwavering gaze. But this time, the storm was different. This time, it was a hurricane, tearing through the foundations of their world, leaving devastation in its wake. The news had come like a thunderbolt, shattering the illusion of security she had lived under for so long. Her father, betrayed by his closest confidant, his own brother, Riccardo. A carefully orchestrated ambush, a swift and brutal takeover. The Romano Empire, built on decades of blood and loyalty, had crumbled in a single night. She remembered the frantic phone call, her Uncle Antonio's voice shaking with fear and disbelief. "Alessandra, Cara, you need to leave. Now. They're coming for you." She had barely had time to pack a small bag, grabbing a few precious photographs, a worn leather-bound journal, and the emerald necklace her father had given her on her 18th birthday. The weight of it in her hand felt like a leaden reminder of everything she was losing. She had fled, guided by Antonio, to a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet neighborhood far from the opulent grandeur of her family home. The stark contrast was jarring, the silence deafening after the constant hum of activity that had always surrounded her. She had spent the night huddled on a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in her mind like a horrifying film reel. The next morning, Antonio had arrived, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "They're offering a deal," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Benedetti. He wants to talk to you." Talk. The word felt absurd, a cruel joke in the face of the devastation that had been wrought. What could she possibly have to say to the man who had destroyed her family, stolen her life? But Antonio had insisted. "It's your only chance, Alessandra. He's not like the others. There might be a way." And so, here she was, sitting in this sterile, silent room, waiting for the devil himself to arrive. Her fingers traced the delicate pattern of the lace tablecloth, a relic from a life that felt a million miles away. She closed her eyes, trying to summon her father's strength, his unwavering resolve. But all she felt was a hollow ache, a deep, gnawing fear that threatened to consume her. The sound of a door opening jolted her back to reality. She lifted her head, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. Dario Benedetti. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence filling the room, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator surveying his territory. He walked towards her, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a face that was both strikingly handsome and undeniably dangerous. His dark hair was swept back from his forehead, revealing a sharp jawline and a mouth that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore a dark suit that seemed to mold to his body, accentuating his powerful build. There was an air of controlled power about him, a sense of barely restrained energy that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't speak, simply stood there, studying her, his eyes like dark pools, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Finally, he moved, pulling out a chair and sitting down opposite her. He leaned back, his fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the armrest. The sound was like a metronome, counting down the seconds to an unknown fate. Alessandra Romano, he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the room. It was a voice that could command armies or soothe a frightened child. It was a voice that made her skin prickle with a strange mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. She met his gaze, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Dario Benedetti, she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or surprise crossed his face. "You're not afraid," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Should I be?" she asked, her voice laced with a defiance she didn't quite feel. He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Most people are," he said.
"But you're different." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail, from the strands of dark hair that had escaped her carefully arranged braid to the slight tremor in her hands. "You have your father's eyes," he said, his voice softening slightly. "And his spirit." The mention of her father sent a fresh wave of pain through her. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "He's gone," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Because of you." Benedetti's expression didn't change. "He made choices," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Choices that had consequences." "And what choice do I have?" she asked, her voice rising in anger. "You've taken everything. My family, my home, my life." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking with hers. "You want to survive?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you'll do exactly as I say." His words hung in the air, a promise and a threat, leaving Alessandra with the chilling realization that her life was no longer her own. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Benedetti. The apartment, though sparsely furnished, possessed a certain understated elegance. The walls were painted a soft, calming gray, and the few pieces of furniture were modern and minimalist, a stark contrast to the ornate, antique-filled rooms of her family home. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a sprawling tapestry of lights twinkling against the darkening sky. But Alessandra found no comfort in the view. It felt alien, disconnected from the life she had known. She was a stranger in a strange land, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Dario had left shortly after issuing his cryptic command, leaving her with more questions than answers. He had arranged for a woman, Maria, to stay with her. Maria was a sturdy, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. She spoke little, but her presence was a reassuring constant in the unsettling emptiness of the apartment. She prepared simple but delicious meals, kept the apartment impeccably clean, and seemed to anticipate Alessandra's needs before she even voiced them. Alessandra spent the first few days in a daze, moving through the motions of daily life without truly engaging. She ate without tasting, slept without resting, and stared out the window without seeing. The grief was a heavy weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She replayed the events of the past few weeks over and over in her mind, searching for answers, for a way to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed her life. She thought of her father, his booming laugh, his warm embrace, his unwavering belief in her. She remembered the stories he had told her about the family history, about their roots in a small Sicilian village, about their journey to Rome and the struggles they had faced in building their empire. He had instilled in her a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, a sense of duty to family. And now, that family was shattered, scattered like dust in the wind. She also thought of her mother, a gentle, refined woman who had died when Alessandra was just a child. She had only fleeting memories of her, a soft voice singing lullabies, a warm hand stroking her hair, the scent of roses that always seemed to cling to her. She wondered what her mother would have thought of all this, how she would have coped with the loss and the betrayal. As the days passed, a flicker of anger began to burn through the fog of grief. Anger at her uncle Riccardo, for his treachery, for tearing apart the family he had sworn to protect. Anger at Dario Benedetti, for his ruthless ambition, for the destruction he had wrought. And anger at herself, for her naivete, for her blindness to the dangers that had lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect world. The anger was a welcome change from the crushing despair. It gave her a focus, a purpose. She started to pay more attention to her surroundings, to the subtle nuances of Maria's behavior, to the news reports on the television, which she had previously avoided. She was searching for clues, for information, for anything that might help her understand the situation she was in, and, perhaps, find a way to fight back. She learned more about Dario Benedetti, not from the news, which painted him as a shadowy, enigmatic figure, but from Maria, who, despite her initial reticence, gradually began to open up to Alessandra. Maria had worked for the Benedetti family for many years, and she spoke of Dario with a mixture of respect and fear. "He is a man of his word," Maria said one evening, as they sat at the small kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea. "He is hard, yes, but he is also just. He does not tolerate disloyalty, but he rewards those who are faithful to him." Maria told her stories of Dario's childhood, of the hardships he had faced, of the burdens he had carried from a young age. His father, Don Antonio Benedetti, had been a powerful and ruthless man, but he had also been a distant and demanding father. Dario had grown up in his shadow, constantly striving to prove himself, to earn his father's approval. He was always a serious child, Maria said, a hint of sadness in her voice. He never had a chance to be young, to be carefree. He was always carrying the weight of the family on his shoulders. Don Antonio had been assassinated when Dario was just 20 years old, leaving him to take the reins of the family business. He had faced numerous challenges, both from rival families and from within his own ranks. He had survived assassination attempts, betrayals, and power struggles, emerging stronger and more determined each time. "He built this empire himself," Maria said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "He is not like the others. He has a code, a sense of honor. He does not kill for pleasure. He does not abuse his power. He protects his own." Alessandra listened intently, trying to reconcile the image of the ruthless, cold-blooded man who had destroyed her family with the portrait Maria was painting. She was still wary, still distrustful, but she couldn't deny that there was something intriguing about Dario Benedetti. He was a puzzle, a mystery, and she was determined to unravel it. One evening, as she was gazing out the window, watching the city lights flicker below, she noticed a black car parked across the street. It was the same car she had seen several times before, always in the same spot, always watching. She knew it was one of Benedetti's men, keeping an eye on her, ensuring she didn't try to escape. The realization that she was a prisoner, however gilded her cage might be, fueled her anger. She was not a pawn to be moved around at will. She was Alessandra Romano, and she would not be controlled. She would find a way to regain her freedom, to avenge her father, to reclaim her life. She turned away from the window, her mind racing, formulating a plan. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would not go down without a fight. She would learn the rules of this new game, and she would play it to win. She would survive. And she would make Dario Benedetti pay for what he had done. The shadows of the Benedetti may have surrounded her, but she would find the light within herself to break free. Chapter 3. An unspoken bargain. The summons came the following evening, delivered by one of Benedetti's men, a silent, imposing figure who simply handed her a small, cream-colored envelope with her name written on it in elegant script. Inside, a single sentence: "Be ready at 8. No signature, but she knew who it was from. Maria helped her choose a dress, a simple but elegant black sheath that hugged her curves without being overtly revealing. She had initially resisted the idea of dressing up for the man who had taken everything from her, but Maria had insisted. "He respects strength, Signorina Alessandra," she had said. "Show him you are not broken." She styled her hair in a sleek chignon, accentuating her high cheekbones and dark eyes. She applied a minimal amount of makeup, just enough to enhance her natural features. She wanted to look presentable, but she didn't want to give the impression that she was trying to please him. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized. The carefree, sheltered girl she had been just weeks ago was gone, replaced by a woman hardened by grief and fueled by a simmering anger. There was a new strength in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. At precisely 8 o'clock, the black car pulled up outside the apartment building. The same silent driver held the door open for her, and she slid into the plush leather seat, her heart pounding against her ribs. The drive was short, taking her to a part of the city she hadn't visited before, a neighborhood of narrow, winding streets and ancient, imposing buildings. The car stopped in front of a discreet, unmarked entrance. The driver led her through a dimly lit hallway and into a large, opulent room. It was a study, lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. And in the center, standing by the window, was Dario Benedetti. He turned as she entered, his dark eyes scanning her from head to toe. He was wearing a dark suit, similar to the one he had worn before, but this time, he wore a dark blue shirt underneath, the color accentuating the intensity of his gaze. He looked even more imposing in this setting, surrounded by the trappings of his power. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "You look different." "Different how?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Stronger," he said.
"More resilient." He gestured towards a pair of armchairs placed near the fire.
"Sit," he said.
She walked towards the chairs, her movements deliberate, her head held high. She sat down, crossing her legs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He sat opposite her, leaning back, his gaze unwavering. "I imagine you're wondering why I brought you here," he said. "I am," she replied. "But I assume it's not for a social call." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that was surprisingly pleasant.
"No," he said.
"It's not." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail. "Your uncle, Riccardo," he said, his voice turning cold. "He betrayed your father. He betrayed his family." "I know that," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He thought he could take over the Romano Empire," Benedetti continued. "He thought he could control everything. He was wrong. And you took advantage of the situation," she said, her voice laced with accusation. He shrugged. "It was a business opportunity," he said. "A chance to expand my influence." "And what about me?" she asked. Am I just another business opportunity?" He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking with hers. "You are a complication," he said. "A loose end." She felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Your father had many enemies," he said. "They would see you as a threat, a symbol of the Romano legacy. They would want to eliminate you. And you're protecting me? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. He smiled, a thin, humorless smile.
I'm offering you a bargain, he said.
A chance to survive. What kind of bargain? She asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He stood up and walked towards the fireplace, his back to her. He stood there for a moment, staring into the flames, his shoulders tense. Then he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. I need an heir, he said, his voice low and intense. Someone to carry on the Benedetti name, to inherit my empire. Alessandra felt her breath catch in her throat. She stared at him, speechless, trying to comprehend the meaning of his words. I'm not interested in marriage, he continued. I don't have time for the complications that come with it. But I need a child.
À son, préférably.
The silence hung thick in the air as his proposal crashed against her fortified walls. He needed a son, an heir, and the solution sat before him in a black dress, hands clenched in her lap.
And you want me too?
She stammered, unable to finish the sentence. He nodded. I want you to bear my child, he said. In return, I will protect you, I will provide for you, and I will ensure that your child has everything he needs to succeed. It was an unspoken bargain, laid bare between them, the air thick with the weight of his words and the future they implied. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Lost Life. The silence that followed his proposition stretched, thick and heavy, filled with the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of Alessandra's heart. Her mind reeled, struggling to process the enormity of his offer, the audacity of it. He wanted her to bear his child, to become a vessel for his ambition, a means to an end. You can't be serious, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. I assure you, Alessandra, I am entirely serious, he replied, his voice calm and controlled. It's a practical solution, a mutually beneficial arrangement. Mutually beneficial? She echoed, her voice rising in disbelief. You call this mutually beneficial? You destroy my family, steal my life, and then you expect me to bear your child as if it were some sort of business transaction? A flicker of irritation crossed his face. I am offering you a chance to survive, he said, his voice hardening. A chance to live a life of comfort and security. Most women would jump at the opportunity. I am not most women, she retorted, her anger flaring. I am Alessandra Romano, and I will not be treated like a broodmare. He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into hers. You have no other options, Alessandra, he said, his voice low and menacing. Your family is gone. Your fortune is lost. You are at my mercy. His words, though chilling, ignited a spark of defiance within her. She may have been at his mercy, but she would not surrender her dignity, her sense of self. There are always options, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I may not have power, but I still have my will. And I will not be coerced into something I don't want. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a flicker of something admiration, perhaps, or respect crossed his face. You have spirit, he said. I'll give you that. He paused, then continued, his voice softening slightly. I understand your reluctance, Alessandra. This is not an easy decision. But I urge you to consider it carefully. It's not just about survival, it's about legacy. Your child would be heir to a vast empire, a powerful force in this world. The thought of having a child, of creating a new life amidst the ruins of her old one, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. But the idea of doing so with him, with the man who had caused her so much pain, was almost unbearable. I need time to think, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded. Of course, he said. I will give you 1 week. But understand this, Alessandra. My patience is not infinite. He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. He walked towards the door, then paused, turning back to her. One more thing, he said, his voice low and intense. Do not try to run. Do not try to contact anyone from your past. I have eyes everywhere. And if you betray me, the consequences will be severe. His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the power he held over her. He left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts, with the weight of his offer pressing down on her. The ride back to the apartment was silent, her mind racing, her emotions in turmoil. She felt trapped, cornered, like a wild animal caught in a snare. But she also felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of defiance. She would not be broken. She would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect herself, and, perhaps, even find a way to turn the tables on him. When she arrived back at the apartment, Maria was waiting for her, her face etched with worry. "Are you all right, Signorina Alessandra?" she asked. "You look pale." Alessandra forced a smile. "I'm fine, Maria," she said. "Just tired." She didn't tell Maria about Benedetti's proposition. She couldn't. Not yet. She needed time to process it herself, to figure out what to do. She went to her room and closed the door, seeking refuge in the familiar silence. She sat on the bed, staring out the window at the city lights. She thought of her father, of the life she had lost, of the uncertain future that lay ahead. She thought of the child Benedetti wanted, the child that could be a symbol of hope or a pawn in his game. She closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered a prayer, a plea for strength, for guidance, for a way out of this darkness. As the echoes of her lost life swirled around her, she clung to the one thing she had left, her will to survive, to find her own path, even in the face of overwhelming odds. She had a week to decide, a week to weigh her options, a week to determine if she could stomach the bargain presented, or if she would forge her own destiny, consequences be damned. Chapter 5. The Weight of Silence. The week that followed was a torment. Alessandra found herself trapped in a suffocating limbo, the weight of Benedetti's proposal pressing down on her, stifling her every thought, every breath. The silence of the apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, amplifying her anxieties and fears. She tried to distract herself, to find solace in the mundane routines of daily life. She helped Maria with the cooking, she read books from the small collection in the apartment, she even attempted to sketch the cityscape from her window. But nothing seemed to work. Her mind kept returning to Benedetti, to his cold, calculating eyes, to the chilling proposition he had laid before her. She tried to analyze the situation rationally, to weigh the pros and cons of accepting his offer. On the one hand, it offered her a chance to survive, to secure a future for herself and a potential child. It offered protection from the enemies of her family, a life of comfort and privilege. On the other hand, it meant surrendering her freedom, her autonomy, her very body to a man she despised. It meant becoming a pawn in his game, a means to an end. The moral dilemma tore at her. Could she bring a child into the world under such circumstances? Could she raise a child in the shadow of the mafia, surrounded by violence and betrayal? Could she bear the thought of being tied to Dario Benedetti for the rest of her life, even if only through their child? She found herself constantly replaying her conversations with Maria, searching for clues, for insights into Benedetti's character. Maria had spoken of his sense of honor, his loyalty to his own, his commitment to justice. But she had also acknowledged his ruthlessness, his willingness to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. One afternoon, while helping Maria prepare lunch, Alessandra decided to probe a little deeper. "Maria," she said, trying to sound casual, "you said Signor Benedetti is a man of his word. Do you truly believe that?" Maria paused, her hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. She looked at Alessandra, her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and caution. "I do, Signorina," she said. "He is not a man who makes promises lightly. If he says he will protect you, he will. But at what cost?" Alessandra asked, her voice trembling slightly. Maria sighed. "Everything has a cost, Signorina," she said. "Especially in this world. But sometimes, the cost of survival is worth paying." Maria's words resonated with Alessandra, but they didn't offer any easy answers. She still couldn't reconcile the image of the ruthless capo with the man who had, in his own way, offered her a lifeline. She spent hours staring out the window, watching the city go about its business, oblivious to her inner turmoil. She envied the people she saw walking down the street, laughing, talking, living their lives without the burden of her choices. She longed for the simplicity of her former life, for the days when her biggest concern was choosing which dress to wear to a party. One evening, as she was sitting by the window, lost in thought, she noticed a familiar figure standing across the street. It was one of Benedetti's men, the same one she had seen before. He was leaning against a lamppost, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her window. The sight of him sent a shiver down her spine. It was a reminder that she was being watched, that she was not free. But it also sparked a flicker of defiance within her. She would not be intimidated. She would not be controlled. She stood up and walked towards the window, her head held high. She looked directly at the man, her gaze unwavering. He didn't move, didn't flinch. They stared at each other for a long moment, a silent battle of wills. Then Alessandra did something unexpected. She smiled. It was a small, subtle smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. It was a smile that said, "I see you. I know you're there, but you don't scare me." The man's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He shifted his weight, his gaze dropping slightly. She had broken the silence, disrupted the power dynamic. She had shown him that she was not a passive victim, that she had a will of her own. That night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she realized that she had made a decision. She would not accept Benedetti's offer, at least not on his terms. She would not surrender her body, her freedom, her future to him. She would find another way. She didn't know what that way was yet, but she knew she would find it. She would use her intelligence, her resilience, her spirit to fight back. She would not be a pawn in his game. She would be the master of her own destiny. The weight of silence was heavy, but it would not crush her. She would find her voice, and she would make it heard. She knew the risks, knew the potential consequences, but a newfound resolve had solidified within her. She would bargain, but it would be on her terms, for her future, and for a life she could choose, not one dictated by the shadows of the Benedetti. Chapter 6. Beneath the Surface of Control. The next morning, Alessandra woke with a newfound sense of purpose. The fog of uncertainty that had clouded her mind for the past week had lifted, replaced by a steely determination. She would not be a victim. She would not be controlled. She would negotiate with Benedetti, but she would do so from a position of strength, not weakness. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant navy blue dress that conveyed both confidence and sophistication. She styled her hair in a classic braid, accentuating her strong features. She applied a minimal amount of makeup, just enough to enhance her natural beauty. She wanted to look presentable, but she also wanted to project an image of strength and independence. She asked Maria to contact Benedetti, to tell him that she was ready to meet. Maria looked at her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Are you sure about this, Signorina Alessandra?"
she asked.
Alessandra nodded. "I am," she said. "I need to do this." Maria made the call, and within an hour, the black car arrived to take her to Benedetti's headquarters. This time, however, she was not taken to the opulent study where they had met before. Instead, she was led to a different part of the building, to a smaller, more intimate office. The room was sparsely furnished, but it had a certain understated elegance. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and a large window offered a view of a private garden. Benedetti was standing by the window, his back to the door, when she entered. He turned as she approached, his dark eyes scanning her from head to toe. He was wearing a gray suit, impeccably tailored, and a crisp white shirt. He looked relaxed, but she knew that beneath the surface of control, he was a man of intense focus and unwavering determination. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You requested this meeting." "I did," she replied, her voice steady. "I've considered your offer, and I have a counterproposal." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. "A counterproposal?" he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement.
"I'm intrigued."
He gestured towards a pair of leather armchairs placed near a small, round table.
"Sit," he said.
She sat down, crossing her legs, her hands clasped in her lap. He sat opposite her, leaning back, his gaze unwavering. "I will not agree to your original terms," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I will not simply be a vessel for your heir." He raised an eyebrow. "And what are your terms, then?" he asked. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I will agree to bear your child," she said, "but only under certain conditions." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking with hers.
"Go on," he said.
"First," she said, "I want a guarantee of my safety and security, not just for myself, but for my child. I want to know that we will be protected from your enemies, from anyone who might try to harm us." "That is already implied," he said. "I would never allow any harm to come to my child or the child's mother."
"I want it in writing," she said.
"A formal agreement, signed by both of us." He nodded.
"Acceptable," he said.
"Second," she continued, "I want financial independence. I want to have control over my own finances, to be able to provide for myself and my child without being completely reliant on you." He frowned slightly. "You will have everything you need," he said. "I will provide for you lavishly." "I don't want to be provided for," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I want to be independent. I want to have my own resources, my own means of support." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Very well," he said. "I will establish a trust fund in your name, with sufficient funds to ensure your financial security." "Third," she said, "and this is the most important condition I want to say in my child's upbringing. I want to be involved in all decisions regarding their education, their welfare, their future. I will not allow my child to be raised solely in the shadow of the mafia." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. This was clearly the condition he had been anticipating, the one that would be the most difficult to concede. "The child will be a Benedetti," he said, his voice firm. "They will be raised according to our traditions, our values." "And what are those traditions?" she asked, her voice challenging. "Violence? Betrayal? Fear?" A flicker of anger crossed his face. "We protect our own," he said. "We honor our commitments. We are loyal to our family." "And what about love?"
she asked.
"What about compassion? What about kindness?" He was silent again, his gaze dropping slightly. She had touched a nerve, exposed a vulnerability beneath his carefully constructed facade of control. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a pawn, but a fierce mother-to-be. "Those things are not incompatible with our way of life," he said, his voice softer now. "Then prove it," she said. "Prove it by allowing me to raise our child with those values alongside yours. Prove it by giving me a voice in their future." She paused, her voice softening, a plea entering her tone. "Let this child be a bridge, Dario, not another brick in the wall." He stood up and walked towards the window, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the garden, his shoulders tense. The silence stretched, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was a silence filled with tension, with uncertainty, but also with a glimmer of hope. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I will consider your terms," he said. "I will need time to adjust." The unspoken words hung between them, a testament to the shift in their dynamic, the subtle crack she had created in his armor of control. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Dark. The days following her counterproposal were filled with a tense anticipation. Alessandra found herself in a strange state of limbo, waiting for Benedetti's response, unsure of what the future held. She had thrown down the gauntlet, challenged his authority, and now she could only wait to see if he would accept her terms or reject them outright. She spent her time exploring the apartment, discovering hidden nooks and crannies, familiarizing herself with the space that had become her temporary home. She found a small balcony overlooking a quiet courtyard, a peaceful oasis amidst the bustling city. She started spending her mornings there, sipping tea and reading, trying to find a sense of normalcy in the midst of the extraordinary circumstances. Maria continued to be a source of quiet support, her presence a reassuring constant in Alessandra's uncertain world. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry, but she offered subtle gestures of kindness, a warm smile, a comforting touch, a freshly baked pastry. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Maria spoke about Dario's mother, Isabella. It was the first time she had mentioned her, and Alessandra listened intently, eager for any insight into the man who held her fate in his hands. She was a beautiful woman, Maria said, her voice filled with a nostalgic sadness. Gentle, kind, and strong. She loved Dario very much, but she also feared for him. She knew the dangers of this life, the burdens he would have to carry. Isabella had died when Dario was young, still a teenager, succumbing to a sudden illness. Maria's words painted a picture of a woman who had tried to shield her son from the darkness of their world, to instill in him a sense of compassion and empathy, despite the harsh realities of their existence. She would have wanted him to be happy, Maria said, her eyes meeting Alessandra's. She would have wanted him to find love, to have a family, to live a life of peace. Alessandra wondered if Dario remembered his mother's wishes, if he ever thought about the kind of life she had envisioned for him. She wondered if there was any part of him that yearned for something more than power, more than control, more than the endless cycle of violence and betrayal. The whispers in the dark started a few nights later. Alessandra was lying in bed, unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of Benedetti, of her future, of the child she might bear. She heard a faint sound, a soft rustling, coming from the living room. She initially dismissed it as her imagination, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more distinct. She got out of bed, her heart pounding, and crept towards the door, listening intently. She heard voices, hushed whispers, coming from the living room. She carefully opened the door a crack, peering into the dimly lit room. She saw two figures standing near the window, their backs to her. One was Maria, and the other was a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, with dark hair and a sharp, angular face. She couldn't make out their words, but she could sense the tension in their voices, the urgency of their conversation. They were talking about her, she was sure of it, and they were talking about Benedetti. She strained to hear, her heart pounding in her chest. She caught snippets of their conversation, fragments of sentences that sent a chill down her spine. Dangerous. Unpredictable. Must be careful.
The child.
She realized that Maria was warning the man, whoever he was, about Benedetti. She was telling him to be careful, to protect her, to watch over the child. Alessandra felt a surge of gratitude towards Maria, a deep appreciation for her loyalty and her courage. But she also felt a growing sense of unease. If Maria, who had worked for the Benedetti family for years, was afraid of Dario, then what did that mean for her? She quietly closed the door and returned to bed, her mind racing. She didn't know who the man was or what his connection to Maria was, but she knew that she was not alone. She had an ally, someone who was looking out for her, someone who was willing to risk everything to protect her. The whispers in the dark continued for the next few nights, always at the same time, always the same hushed voices, the same sense of urgency. Alessandra never confronted Maria, never revealed that she knew about the secret meetings. She trusted Maria, and she didn't want to jeopardize her safety. But now the apartment was filled with unspoken words, unknown loyalties. She had to tread even more carefully in this new development. But the whispers also gave her a sense of hope. They reminded her that she was not powerless, that she had resources, that she could fight back. She was not alone in this struggle. She had allies, hidden in the shadows, waiting to help her. The knowledge strengthened her resolve, fueled her determination to negotiate with Benedetti on her own terms, to secure a future for herself and her child, a future free from fear and control. She would listen to the whispers, learn from them, and use them to her advantage. She would navigate this treacherous path, one step at a time, until she found her way to freedom. Chapter 8. A Glimmer of Defiance. 3 days after her counterproposal, Dario summoned her again. This time, the meeting took place in his private residence, a sprawling villa nestled in the hills overlooking Rome. The estate was a fortress, surrounded by high walls and guarded by armed men. It was a display of power, of wealth, of control, designed to intimidate and impress. Alessandra was escorted through the lavishly decorated halls, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old money. She passed priceless works of art, antique furniture, and glittering chandeliers. It was a world of opulence and privilege, a world far removed from the simple, quiet life she had once known. She was led to a large terrace overlooking a manicured garden. Dario was standing by the railing, his back to the door, gazing out at the panoramic view. He was wearing a casual linen shirt and trousers, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. He looked relaxed, almost vulnerable, but Alessandra knew that appearances could be deceiving. He turned as she approached, his dark eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, admiration, perhaps, or curiosity, but it was quickly masked. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You look well." "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "You wish to see me." He gestured towards a pair of comfortable chairs placed near a small table laden with refreshments. "Please sit," he said. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He sat opposite her, leaning back, his gaze unwavering. "I have considered your proposal," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment of truth. This was where her future would be decided. "And?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail. "Your terms are demanding," he said. "Unconventional. But necessary," she replied, her voice firm. "If this is to work, it must be on equal footing." He smiled, a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "You have courage, Alessandra," he said. "I admire that." He paused again, then continued, his voice softening slightly. "I agree to your terms," he said. "All of them." Alessandra felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense that it almost brought her to her knees. She had done it. She had stood up to him, challenged his authority, and won. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded. "But understand this, Alessandra," he said, his voice hardening. "This is not a partnership. It is an agreement. You will bear my child, and you will raise them according to the terms we have agreed upon. But I am still the head of this family. I am still in charge." "I understand," she said. "But I will not be silenced. I will not be a puppet. I will have a voice in my child's life." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he extended his hand towards her. "We have a deal, then?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly gentle. It was a handshake, a formal agreement, but it was also something more. It was a connection, a recognition of their shared future, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded them. "We have a deal," she said, her voice firm. As they released hands, a subtle shift occurred. The power dynamic, while still present, had softened. Alessandra had shown a defiance that intrigued Dario, a willingness to challenge his control that sparked a respect he hadn't anticipated. He poured them both a glass of wine from a crystal decanter on the table. "To our agreement," he said, raising his glass. Alessandra raised hers, her gaze meeting his. "To the future," she said, her voice filled with a newfound confidence. They drank in silence, the tension between them still palpable, but there was also a sense of anticipation, of possibility. The agreement was made, the bargain struck. But the journey was just beginning. Alessandra knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But she was no longer afraid. She had found her strength, her voice, her glimmer of defiance. And she would use it to navigate this treacherous path, to protect herself and her child, to create a future that was worthy of the Romano name and, perhaps, to find a way to bridge the gap between two very different worlds. The glimmer was small, but it was there, a spark of hope in the vast, uncertain landscape of their intertwined destinies. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. With the agreement formalized, Alessandra's life entered a new, even more complex phase. She remained in the apartment, but her days were now punctuated by visits from Dario, sometimes for formal discussions about the future, sometimes for seemingly casual conversations that always seemed to carry an undercurrent of unspoken tension. He began to involve her in certain aspects of his life, introducing her to some of his trusted associates, taking her to discreet social gatherings, always careful to maintain a distance, to keep their arrangement a secret from the wider world. It was a delicate dance, a balancing act between his need for an heir and his need to protect his reputation, his power, his control. Alessandra observed him closely during these encounters, trying to decipher the man behind the mask, to understand the complexities of his character. She saw glimpses of the ruthlessness that had made him so feared, the cold calculation that guided his every move. But she also saw moments of vulnerability, flashes of a deeper humanity that he kept carefully hidden. She learned more about the intricacies of the mafia world, the complex web of alliances and rivalries, the codes of honor, and the brutal realities of power. She realized that Dario's life was a constant balancing act, a delicate dance between protecting his family, maintaining his authority, and navigating the treacherous waters of his profession. One evening, Dario took her to a small, family-run trattoria in Trastevere, a neighborhood known for its authentic Roman cuisine and its vibrant atmosphere. It was a place he had frequented since childhood, a place where he felt comfortable, where he could let his guard down, at least partially. They sat at a secluded table in the back, the air filled with the aroma of garlic, basil, and freshly baked bread. They talked about their childhoods, their families, their dreams. Alessandra spoke about her father, her love for art and literature, her hopes for a peaceful, fulfilling life. Dario spoke about his mother, her gentle spirit, her unwavering love, her desire for him to find happiness. For a brief moment, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. They were just two people, sharing a meal, sharing stories, connecting on a human level. Alessandra saw a glimpse of the man Dario might have been, if he hadn't been born into this world, if he hadn't been forced to carry the weight of his family's legacy on his shoulders. But the moment was fleeting. As they were leaving the trattoria, a group of men approached them, their faces hard, their eyes filled with menace. They were from a rival family, one of Dario's enemies. Dario's demeanor changed instantly. He became the capo again, the ruthless leader, the man who commanded fear and respect. He pushed Alessandra behind him, shielding her with his body, his hand moving towards the gun he always carried concealed beneath his jacket. "Benedetti," one of the men sneered. "We've been waiting for you." Dario's voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes were like ice. "You have made a mistake," he said. "Walk away." The men laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "We're not afraid of you, Benedetti," one of them said. "Your time is over." A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with danger. Alessandra watched, her heart pounding, her fear battling with a strange sense of admiration for Dario's courage, his unwavering protection of her. Just as it seemed violence was inevitable, a group of Dario's men appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. They surrounded the rival gang, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. The tension broke, the rival gang backed down, disappearing into the night. Dario turned to Alessandra, his face a mask of concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He escorted her back to the car, his hand resting protectively on her back. The ride back to the apartment was silent, but the silence was filled with a new understanding. Alessandra had witnessed firsthand the price of loyalty, the constant threat of violence that hung over Dario's life, the danger that she and her child would inevitably face. She realized that her agreement with Dario was not just about bearing his child, it was about entering his world, a world of shadows and secrets, a world where loyalty was paramount and betrayal could be fatal. The price of loyalty was high, but she was beginning to understand that it was also a bond, a connection, a force that could protect as well as destroy. She was now a part of that world, whether she liked it or not, and she would have to learn to navigate its treacherous currents, to protect herself and her child, to find her place within the intricate web of the Benedetti family. Chapter 10. Scars of the Past. Several weeks into her pregnancy, Alessandra began to experience vivid dreams, recurring nightmares that haunted her sleep and left her waking in a cold sweat. The dreams were fragmented, disjointed, filled with images of violence, betrayal, and loss. She saw her father's face, contorted in pain, his eyes filled with accusation. She saw her uncle Ricardo, laughing maniacally, his hands stained with blood. She saw Dario, his face a mask of cold indifference, turning away from her as she pleaded for help. She confided in Maria, sharing the disturbing details of her dreams, seeking comfort and understanding. Maria listened patiently, her eyes filled with concern. "These are just dreams, Signorina Alessandra," Maria said, her voice soothing. "They are a manifestation of your fears, your anxieties. They are not real." But Alessandra couldn't shake the feeling that the dreams were more than just random firings of her subconscious. They felt like warnings, like echoes of the past, like glimpses into a future she couldn't quite grasp. One night, the dream was particularly intense. She saw herself standing in a darkened room, surrounded by shadowy figures. She heard voices, whispering secrets, plotting betrayals. She saw a knife, glinting in the dim light, raised to strike. She saw blood, spreading across the floor, staining everything it touched. She woke up screaming, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. Maria rushed to her side, holding her, comforting her, trying to calm her down. "It's all right, Signorina," Maria said, her voice soothing. "It was just a dream. You're safe here." But Alessandra couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the sense of impending doom. She felt like she was trapped in a web of secrets, surrounded by enemies she couldn't see, threatened by forces she couldn't understand. The next day, Dario visited the apartment. He noticed her pallor, her haunted eyes, the dark circles beneath them. "Alessandra," he said, his voice filled with concern. "You look unwell. What's wrong?" She hesitated, unsure whether to confide in him, to share her fears, her vulnerabilities. But she needed to talk to someone, to find some sense of reassurance. She told him about the dreams, about the recurring images of violence and betrayal, about the feeling of impending doom. She expected him to dismiss her concerns, to tell her she was being irrational, to attribute it to her pregnancy. But he surprised her. He listened intently, his expression serious, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. "Dreams can be powerful things," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "They can be reflections of our deepest fears, our hidden anxieties. But they can also be warnings, messages from our subconscious, telling us to be careful, to be vigilant." He told her about his own dreams, about the nightmares that had haunted him since childhood, about the images of violence and loss that he had witnessed, the betrayals he had endured. "I learned to control my dreams," he said, "to use them as a source of strength, as a reminder of the dangers I face, as a motivation to stay one step ahead of my enemies." He taught her a technique, a method of focusing her mind, of controlling her thoughts, of transforming her fears into a source of power. He told her to visualize a safe place, a sanctuary, a place where she felt protected and loved. He told her to repeat a mantra, a phrase that would calm her mind and soothe her spirit. "You are strong, Alessandra," he said, his voice firm. "You are resilient. You are a Romano, and you will not be defeated by fear." His words resonated with her, giving her a sense of hope, a glimmer of strength in the darkness that surrounded her. She practiced the technique he had taught her, visualizing her childhood home, the gardens where she had played, the scent of roses that had always reminded her of her mother. The dreams didn't disappear entirely, but they became less frequent, less intense. She learned to control her fear, to transform it into a source of strength, to use it as a tool to navigate the treacherous waters of her new life. She realized that Dario, despite his ruthlessness, despite his cold exterior, had a deep understanding of fear, of vulnerability, of the scars of the past. He had learned to live with his demons, to control them, to use them to his advantage. He had shown her another layer of himself, and in sharing his own scars, he had forged a deeper connection with her, a bond of shared experience, a glimmer of trust in the midst of the darkness. The scars of the past were still there, etched deep within their souls, but they were no longer just sources of pain. They were reminders of their resilience, their strength, their ability to survive. They were a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the capacity to find hope even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Chapter 11. Between Two Worlds. As Alessandra's pregnancy progressed, she found herself increasingly caught between two worlds, the opulent, dangerous world of the Benedetti and the quiet, simple life she had once known. She was carrying the heir to a powerful mafia empire, yet she yearned for a life of normalcy, of peace, of love, a life far removed from the violence and betrayal that surrounded her. Dario continued to visit regularly, his presence a constant reminder of the complex reality she inhabited. He was attentive, protective, even surprisingly gentle at times. He brought her gifts, small tokens of his affection, books, flowers, a beautiful antique music box that played a haunting melody. He also began to include her in more aspects of his life, taking her to social events, introducing her to his inner circle, carefully crafting a narrative that presented her as a distant relative, a respected acquaintance, someone who held a position of honor within his extended family. Alessandra played her part, navigating the treacherous waters of mafia society with a grace and intelligence that surprised even her. She learned to read between the lines, to decipher the subtle cues, to understand the unspoken rules of this complex world. She was a keen observer, absorbing information, learning the intricacies of power dynamics, the delicate balance between loyalty and betrayal. She also started to develop relationships with some of the people she met, forming unexpected connections with women who, like her, were navigating the complexities of life within the mafia. She found a surprising camaraderie with some of them, sharing stories, offering support, finding a sense of community in this otherwise isolated world. One woman, Sophia, the wife of one of Dario's closest lieutenants, became a particularly close confidant. Sophia was a few years older than Alessandra, with a warm smile and a sharp wit. She had grown up within the mafia, and she understood the challenges, the dangers, the unspoken rules. "This life is not easy, Alessandra," Sophia said one afternoon, as they sat together in Sophia's garden, sipping tea. "It demands strength, resilience, and a certain detachment. But it also offers a unique kind of bond, a loyalty that is unbreakable." Sophia shared stories of her own experiences, of the sacrifices she had made, of the fears she had faced, of the love she had found amidst the chaos. She offered Alessandra advice, guidance, and a sense of perspective. "You must find your own way, Alessandra," Sophia said. "You must decide what kind of life you want for yourself, for your child. You must be true to yourself, even in this world of shadows." Alessandra listened intently, absorbing Sophia's wisdom, learning from her experience. She realized that she was not alone, that there were others who understood her struggles, who shared her hopes and fears. She also began to explore her own creative outlets, finding solace in art, in music, in writing. She started sketching again, filling her notebooks with drawings of the city, of the people she met, of the emotions she felt. She rediscovered her love for literature, devouring books of all genres, finding escape and inspiration in the words of others. She even started writing her own stories, short vignettes about her experiences, her observations, her dreams. She wrote about the beauty of the city, the darkness of the underworld, the complexities of human relationships. She wrote about her hopes for her child, her longing for a life of peace, her determination to find her own path. These creative pursuits were her refuge, her escape from the pressures of her reality. They allowed her to express herself, to process her emotions, to find a sense of purpose and meaning in this otherwise chaotic world. She was living between two worlds, balancing the demands of her new reality with the longings of her heart. She was learning to navigate the treacherous currents of the mafia, while also staying true to herself, to her values, to her dreams. She was a Romano, carrying the legacy of her family, but she was also becoming a Benedetti, embracing the complexities of her new life. The journey was far from over, but she was finding her way, step by step, navigating the shadows, seeking the light, forging her own path between two worlds, determined to create a future for herself and her child, a future that would be both safe and fulfilling. She was adapting, learning, evolving, growing stronger with each passing day, finding her place within the intricate tapestry of her new life, a life that was both challenging and surprisingly rewarding. Chapter 12. The Unraveling Truth. As Alessandra's pregnancy entered its final months, a series of events began to unfold that threatened to shatter the fragile peace she had carefully constructed. The whispers in the dark grew louder, the secrets more dangerous, the truths more elusive. One evening, Maria came to her room, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Signorina Alessandra," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to tell you something. Something important." Alessandra felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had sensed that Maria was hiding something, that there were secrets she wasn't sharing. "What is it, Maria?" she asked, her voice calm, despite the tremor in her heart. Maria hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as if afraid of being overheard. "It's about your uncle," she said. "Ricardo." Alessandra's breath caught in her throat. Ricardo. The man who had betrayed her father, the man who had orchestrated the downfall of the Romano Empire, the man she had believed to be dead. "What about him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "He's not dead," Maria said, her voice shaking. "He's alive. And he's working with someone. Someone powerful." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. This was the news she had been dreading, the confirmation of her worst fears. Ricardo was alive, and he was plotting against her, against Dario, against the future of her child. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who is he working with?" Maria hesitated again, her eyes filled with fear.
"I don't know for sure," she said.
"But I heard whispers of a name that chills the blood even of the most hardened men, Donatello Moretti." Moretti. The name was like a punch to the gut. Donatello Moretti was the head of one of the most powerful mafia families in Italy, a rival of the Benedetti, a man known for his ruthlessness, his cruelty, his insatiable hunger for power. Alessandra felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was worse than she had imagined. Ricardo, working with Moretti, was a threat not just to her and Dario, but to the entire balance of power within the mafia world.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would he do this?" Maria shook her head. "Revenge," she said.
"Greed."
"Power. He wants to destroy the Benedetti, to reclaim what he believes is rightfully his. And he will stop at nothing to achieve his goals." Maria revealed that she had been secretly communicating with a contact within the Moretti family, a man who had once been loyal to her father, a man who is now risking his life to provide her with information. "He told me that Ricardo is planning something big," Maria said. "Something that will shake the foundations of the mafia world. He doesn't know the details, but he knows it's coming soon." Alessandra felt a surge of fear, but also a surge of determination. She would not allow Ricardo and Moretti to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. She would not allow them to harm her child. She knew she had to tell Dario, to warn him about the impending threat. But she also knew that she had to be careful. She couldn't trust anyone completely. She had to protect herself, her child, and Maria. "Thank you, Maria," she said, her voice firm. "You have risked your life for me. I will never forget that." Maria nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Be careful, Signorina Alessandra," she said. "This is a dangerous game, and the stakes are higher than ever." Alessandra spent the rest of the night awake, her mind racing, formulating a plan. She knew that she had to act quickly, decisively, to protect herself and her child. The unraveling truth was a terrifying revelation, a threat that loomed large, casting a shadow over everything she held dear. But she would not be paralyzed by fear. She would use her intelligence, her courage, her newfound knowledge to fight back, to protect her future, to ensure the survival of her child, even if it meant confronting the darkest forces of the mafia world. She would be ready. Chapter 13. A dance of deception. Alessandra knew she had to inform Dario about Riccardo and Moretti's alliance, but she couldn't simply blurt out the information. She needed to be strategic, to present the news in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion, that wouldn't reveal Maria's involvement. She needed to play the game, to engage in a dance of deception, to protect herself and her source. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Dario, using the pretext of discussing the final arrangements for the birth of their child. He agreed to see her at his villa, the same place where they had struck their initial agreement. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress that conveyed both confidence and vulnerability. She wanted to appear calm and collected, but also slightly apprehensive, as if she were seeking his reassurance, his protection. When she arrived at the villa, she was escorted to the terrace, where Dario was waiting for her. He greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of affection and concern. "Alessandra," he said, his voice gentle. "You look troubled. What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been having concerns," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About the future, about the safety of our child." He frowned, his expression turning serious. "What kind of concerns?" he asked. She hesitated, pretending to be reluctant to share her fears. "I've heard rumors," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Whispers about old enemies plotting against us." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking with hers. "What rumors?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Who have you been talking to?" She shook her head.
"No one specific," she said.
"Just whispers in the air, things I've overheard, it's probably nothing," but she let her voice trail off, feigning uncertainty. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He was trying to assess her credibility, to determine if she was telling the truth, or if she was playing some kind of game. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice firm. "Don't leave anything out." She recounted the rumors she had overheard, carefully weaving a narrative that presented Riccardo and Moretti as a potential threat, without revealing the source of her information. She spoke of their past rivalries, their shared ambition, their desire for revenge. She emphasized her own fears, her concerns for the safety of their child, her need for his protection. She played the role of the vulnerable woman, seeking reassurance from the powerful man who held her fate in his hands. Dario listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. He didn't interrupt her, didn't question her. He simply absorbed the information, processing it, analyzing it. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. "You did well to tell me this, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and intense. "These are serious allegations. I will investigate them thoroughly." He assured her that he would take all necessary precautions, that he would protect her and their child, that he would not allow anyone to harm them. "Trust me, Alessandra," he said, his voice firm. "I will not let anything happen to you, or to our child." She nodded, pretending to be relieved, to be reassured by his words. "Thank you, Dario," she said, her voice soft. "I trust you." But beneath the surface of her calm demeanor, her mind was racing. She had planted the seed, delivered the warning, but she knew that this was just the beginning. She had to remain vigilant, to continue to gather information, to protect herself and Maria. The dance of deception had begun. She was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between trust and betrayal, between loyalty and survival. She had to be careful, to be strategic, to anticipate every move, to stay one step ahead of her enemies. She knew that Dario would be investigating the rumors, that he would be looking for the source of the information. She had to be prepared for his questions, for his scrutiny. She had to maintain her facade, to continue to play the role of the innocent, vulnerable woman, while secretly working to protect herself and her child. The stakes were higher than ever. The future was uncertain. But she was determined to survive, to protect her child, to navigate this treacherous path, to emerge victorious from this deadly dance. She had to be cunning, resourceful, and above all, she had to be brave. The game was on, and she was ready to play. Chapter 14. Cracks in the Facade. Dario's investigation into the rumors Alessandra had relayed was swift and ruthless. He mobilized his network of informants, deploying his most trusted lieutenants to uncover the truth behind the alleged alliance between Riccardo Romano and Donatello Moretti. The villa, once a haven of relative tranquility, became a hub of hushed conversations, coded messages, and a palpable sense of heightened alert. Alessandra, while outwardly maintaining a facade of calm reliance on Dario's protection, found herself increasingly drawn into the vortex of his investigation. She observed him closely, noticing the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the increased security measures, the late-night meetings with his advisors. She was careful not to ask direct questions to avoid arousing suspicion, but she gleaned information from overheard conversations, from the tense atmosphere that permeated the villa, from the worried expressions on the faces of his men. She learned that Dario's informants had confirmed the existence of a clandestine meeting between Riccardo and Moretti, a meeting that had taken place in a secluded location outside Rome. The details of the meeting were still unknown, but the fact that it had occurred at all was enough to confirm Dario's suspicions and to fuel his determination to neutralize the threat. One evening, Dario summoned Alessandra to his study. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, but his expression was resolute. "Alessandra," he said, his voice low and serious. "I have news." She felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She knew that this was it, the moment of truth. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Riccardo is indeed working with Moretti. They're planning something big. We don't know the specifics yet, but it's clear that they intend to strike against us." Alessandra feigned surprise and fear, playing her role perfectly. "Oh, Dario," she said, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We will be ready for them," he said. "I will not let them harm you or our child. I promise you that." He then revealed that he had discovered the identity of Maria's informant, the man within the Moretti family who had been feeding her information. Alessandra's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been dreading.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dario's expression darkened. "He was betrayed," he said. "Someone within Moretti's ranks revealed his identity. He was tortured."
"Killed."
Alessandra felt a wave of grief and guilt wash over her. Maria's informant, a man who had risked his life to help her, was dead. And his death was indirectly her fault. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Dario nodded. "He was a brave man," he said. "He died protecting us." He then turned the conversation back to Alessandra, his eyes searching hers. "Alessandra," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to know everything. I need to know how you learned about this alliance. Who told you?" Alessandra knew that she could no longer maintain her deception. She had to tell him the truth, at least part of it. "It was Maria," she said, her voice trembling. She overheard some things. She has contacts." Dario's expression hardened.
"Maria?"
he said, his voice laced with suspicion.
"How?"
Alessandra explained Maria's connection to the informant, her loyalty to Alessandra's father, her desire to protect her and her child. She omitted the details of the late-night meetings, the whispered conversations, the extent of Maria's involvement. Dario listened intently, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He was assessing her words, weighing her credibility, trying to determine if she was telling him the whole truth. He was seeing the cracks in the facade she had built. "Maria will be questioned," he said, his voice cold. "I need to know everything she knows." Alessandra felt a surge of fear. She knew that Maria was in danger, that Dario's interrogation could be brutal, even fatal. "Please, Dario," she pleaded. "She's loyal. She's only trying to help." "Loyalty must be proven," he said, his voice unwavering. "In this world, trust is a luxury we cannot afford." The cracks were widening, the carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble. Alessandra knew she had to tread carefully, to protect Maria, to navigate this increasingly dangerous situation, to somehow maintain Dario's trust while safeguarding the secrets that could unravel everything. Chapter 15. The Heart's Betrayal. Alessandra's plea to spare Maria from harsh interrogation fell on deaf ears. Dario, driven by a mixture of suspicion and the need to maintain control, ordered Maria to be brought to the villa for questioning. Alessandra was frantic, torn between her loyalty to Maria and her fear of revealing the full extent of their clandestine activities. She knew that Maria, under pressure, might reveal information that could endanger them both, exposing Alessandra's active role in gathering intelligence. She tried to reason with Dario, arguing that Maria was a simple woman, motivated only by a desire to protect her, that she posed no real threat. But Dario was adamant. He insisted that he needed to know everything Maria knew, that he couldn't afford to take any chances, that the safety of their child depended on it. Alessandra watched in helpless anguish as Maria, her face pale but resolute, was escorted to Dario's study. She paced anxiously outside the closed door, her heart pounding, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She could hear muffled voices, the occasional raised tone, but she couldn't make out the words. The interrogation stretched on for hours, the tension in the villa growing thicker with each passing moment. Alessandra felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. She was torn between her loyalty to Maria, the woman who had been her confidant and protector, and her growing feelings for Dario, the man who was the father of her child, the man who, despite his ruthlessness, had shown her moments of tenderness and vulnerability. Finally, the door to the study opened, and Maria emerged, her face ashen, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. She looked at Alessandra, a silent apology in her gaze, and then she was escorted away by Dario's men. Dario emerged from the study, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury that sent a shiver down Alessandra's spine. She confessed, he said, his voice hard. She admitted to everything. To communicating with the informant, to gathering information, to conspiring against me. Alessandra felt her world crumbling around her. Maria had betrayed her, or rather, she had been forced to betray her. The full extent of their deception had been revealed, and now she was at Dario's mercy. Dario, she began, her voice trembling, but he cut her off. You lied to me, Alessandra, he said, his voice laced with a chilling calm. You manipulated me.
You used me.
She tried to explain, to justify her actions, to plead for understanding, but he wouldn't listen. He was consumed by a sense of betrayal, a feeling of having been deceived by the one person he had started to trust. I offered you protection, he said, his voice low and menacing. I offered you a future, and you repaid me with lies and deceit. He turned away from her, his shoulders tense, his fists clenched. She could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that was masked by anger and resentment. I thought you were different, Alessandra, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought you were someone I could trust, someone I could care for. His words pierced her heart like a knife. She had betrayed him, not just as the capo, but as a man. She had hurt him deeply, and she knew that she might never be able to repair the damage. This was the heart's betrayal, the unraveling of the fragile bond that had begun to form between them, the shattering of the trust that had been so painstakingly built. Dario, please, she pleaded. I did it to protect us. To protect our child. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with fury. You did it for yourself, he said. You did it to gain power, to control the situation. You are just like your father, just like your uncle. You are Romano, through and through. His words were like a slap in the face. He had reduced her to her lineage, to the legacy of betrayal and violence that she had been trying so hard to escape. He had stripped her of her individuality, of her humanity, of her hope for a different future. The heart's betrayal cut both ways, leaving them both wounded and isolated. The fragile bridge between them was shattered, perhaps beyond repair. She was left standing in the ruins of their unspoken connection, facing the consequences of her actions, and the devastating realization that she had lost not only his trust, but perhaps a chance at a different kind of life, a life beyond the shadows of the mafia. Chapter 16. Reckoning with Fate. The aftermath of Maria's confession and Alessandra's exposure was swift and brutal. Dario, consumed by a sense of betrayal and fueled by a need to reassert control, ordered Alessandra to be confined to her quarters within the villa. She was effectively a prisoner, her movements restricted, her communication with the outside world severed. Guards were posted outside her door, their presence a constant reminder of her precarious situation. She spent her days in a state of anxious isolation, her mind replaying the events that had led to her downfall. She regretted her deception, her manipulation of Dario, but she also knew that she had acted out of a desperate desire to protect herself and her child. She had been caught in a web of circumstances, forced to make impossible choices, and now she was paying the price. She thought of Maria, wondering about her fate, fearing the worst. She knew that Dario could be ruthless, that he wouldn't hesitate to punish those who betrayed him. She prayed for Maria's safety, hoping that she would somehow survive his wrath. She also thought of her unborn child, the innocent life growing within her, the life that was now caught in the crossfire of this deadly conflict. She felt a surge of protective instinct, a fierce determination to ensure her child's safety, no matter the cost. One evening, Dario came to her room. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked like regret. "Alessandra," he said, his voice cold and formal. "We need to talk." She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She knew that this was it, the moment of reckoning. "I'm listening," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He entered the room, closing the door behind him. He walked towards the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "I have made a decision," he said, his voice low and intense. "About your future. About the future of our child." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She braced herself for the worst, expecting him to banish her, to take her child away from her, to condemn her to a life of exile and despair. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "I cannot trust you, Alessandra," he said. "You have proven that. But I also cannot deny the bond we share. The child we have created." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "I will not punish you," he said. "I will not take your child away from you. But you will remain here, under my protection, under my control. You will have no contact with the outside world. You'll be a prisoner, but a privileged one." Alessandra felt a mixture of relief and despair. She was not being banished, she was not losing her child, but she was also not free. She was trapped, confined to this gilded cage, forever at Dario's mercy. "And Maria?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dario's expression hardened. "Maria will be dealt with," he said. "She betrayed me. She will pay the price." Alessandra pleaded with him, begged him to spare Maria's life, but he refused. He was unyielding, his sense of betrayal too deep, his need for justice too strong. "She knew the risks," he said, his voice cold. "She made her choice." Alessandra realized that she had lost. She had failed to protect Maria, she had failed to secure her own freedom, she had failed to build a bridge of trust with Dario. She was trapped, defeated, her fate sealed. She was to reckon with her fate. She looked at Dario, her eyes filled with tears. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I accept your decision." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I will ensure that you and our child are well cared for," he said. "You will have everything you need." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "I once thought that we could have had something different," he said, his voice filled with a hint of regret. "But it was not meant to be." He left the room, closing the door behind him, leaving Alessandra alone with her thoughts, with her grief, with the crushing weight of her fate. She was a prisoner, but she was also a mother. And she would do whatever it took to protect her child, to survive, to find a way to navigate this new reality, to make the best of the hand she had been dealt. Her reckoning with fate was a bitter pill to swallow, but she would face it with courage, with resilience, with the unwavering determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose but the life growing within her. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. Despite her confinement, Alessandra refused to be completely broken. The fire of rebellion still flickered within her, fueled by a fierce love for her unborn child and a lingering resentment towards Dario's control. She might be a prisoner, but she wouldn't be a passive one. She would find ways to assert her will, to maintain her dignity, to subtly challenge his authority, even within the confines of her gilded cage. She began to make small demands, requesting books, art supplies, access to the villa's garden. She pushed the boundaries of her confinement, testing the limits of Dario's control, asserting her presence, refusing to be completely silenced. She also started to cultivate relationships with the staff who attended to her, the maids, the cooks, the gardeners. She treated them with kindness and respect, learning their names, listening to their stories, forging connections that transcended the rigid hierarchy of the villa. She was building a network of allies, however small, creating a support system within the very heart of Dario's domain. She knew that Dario was watching her, monitoring her every move, but she didn't care. She would not be intimidated. She would not be silenced. She would continue to assert her will, to maintain her sense of self, to prepare for the day when she might have a chance to reclaim her freedom. One day, she discovered a hidden passage within the villa, a narrow, dusty corridor that led from her wing to a secluded part of the garden. It was a secret escape route, a way to bypass the guards, to move freely within the grounds, undetected. She began to use the passage regularly, exploring the garden at night, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the cool earth beneath her feet, reconnecting with the natural world. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was a significant one. It gave her a sense of freedom, a sense of control, a sense of hope. She also used the passage to meet with some of the staff, the ones she had come to trust, the ones who had shown her kindness and loyalty. She shared her story with them, her fears, her hopes, her dreams. She learned about their lives, their struggles, their aspirations. She was building a community, a network of support, a secret alliance within the walls of her prison. One evening, as she was returning from her secret garden excursion, she overheard a conversation between two of Dario's guards. They were talking about a planned attack, a coordinated assault on a rival family, a move that Dario was orchestrating to consolidate his power. Alessandra realized that this was it, the opportunity she had been waiting for. She knew that if Dario's plan succeeded, he would become even more powerful, more ruthless, more untouchable. She had to do something to stop him, to disrupt his plans, to prevent further bloodshed. She decided to use her secret network, her allies within the staff, to send a message to the rival family, to warn them about the impending attack. It was a risky move, a dangerous gamble, but she was willing to take the risk. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a larger cause, for a chance to break the cycle of violence, to create a better future for her child. She wrote a coded message, concealing it within a bouquet of flowers, and entrusted it to one of her most trusted allies, a young maid who had family connections to the rival clan. The maid, risking her own life, delivered the message, alerting the rival family to Dario's plans. The attack, when it came, was a failure. The rival family, forewarned, was prepared, and Dario's forces were met with fierce resistance. The ensuing battle resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, but Dario's plan to consolidate his power was thwarted. Dario was furious. He knew that he had been betrayed, that someone within his own ranks had leaked information to his enemies. He launched a ruthless investigation, determined to uncover the traitor, to punish them severely. Alessandra watched, her heart pounding, her fear battling with a sense of grim satisfaction. She had struck a blow, however small, against his power. She had disrupted his plans. She had saved lives. She had fanned the flames of rebellion. And she was ready for the consequences. She knew that her actions would not go unpunished, but she was prepared to face his wrath. She had chosen her side, and she would stand by her decision, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The flames were burning bright, and she would not let them be extinguished. Chapter 18. The Cost of Freedom. Dario's investigation into the leak that had sabotaged his attack was swift and merciless. He interrogated his men, his advisors, even the household staff, his suspicion falling on anyone who might have had access to information or the opportunity to communicate with his enemies. The villa became a place of fear and paranoia, the air thick with tension and distrust. Alessandra knew that it was only a matter of time before his suspicion fell on her. She had been careful, she had covered her tracks, but she also knew that Dario was intelligent, perceptive, and ruthless. He would leave no stone unturned in his quest to uncover the truth. She prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation, steeling her nerves, rehearsing her denials, trying to anticipate his questions, his accusations. She knew that she was walking a tightrope, that one wrong word, one slip-up, could expose her and lead to dire consequences. The summons came late one evening. A guard appeared at her door, his face grim, his expression devoid of emotion. "Signor Benedetti requests your presence in his study," he said, his voice cold and formal. Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. The moment of truth. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and followed the guard, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Dario was waiting for her in his study, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. He was standing by the window, his back to the door, his shoulders tense. The room was dimly lit, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken accusations. He turned as she entered, his dark eyes piercing hers. "Alessandra," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We have a problem." She met his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. "What is it, Dario?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He walked towards her, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She feigned innocence, pretending to be shocked, confused. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't play games with me, Alessandra," he said. "I know it was you. You leaked information to my enemies. You sabotaged my plans." She continued to deny it, clinging to her facade of innocence, but she knew that it was futile. He had evidence, proof of her involvement.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you find out?" He smiled, a cruel, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You underestimated me, Alessandra," he said.
"You thought you could outsmart me."
"You were wrong." He revealed that he had intercepted the message she had sent, the coded message concealed within the bouquet of flowers. He had deciphered the code, identified the maid who had delivered it, and extracted a confession from her. Alessandra felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had been caught. Her deception had been exposed. And now she was at his mercy. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You know the price of betrayal, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You know what I do to those who cross me." She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She expected him to strike her, to imprison her, to take her child away from her. She was prepared to face the consequences of her actions, to pay the cost of freedom. But then, something unexpected happened. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. "But I cannot bring myself to harm you," he said, his voice softening slightly.
"Not you."
"Not the mother of my child." Alessandra opened her eyes, staring at him in disbelief. She couldn't understand him. He was a man of contradictions, a mixture of ruthlessness and something else. Something that looked like love, or perhaps a twisted version of it.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shrugged.
"I don't know," he said.
"Perhaps I'm a fool. Perhaps I'm weak. But I cannot hurt you." He turned away from her, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You will remain here," he said, his voice regaining its firmness. "Under even stricter confinement. You will have no contact with anyone. You will be a ghost. A shadow." It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even close. But it was a reprieve. It was a chance to survive, to protect her child, to live to fight another day. The cost of freedom was high, and she had not fully paid it, but she had also not been completely defeated. She had defied him, she had challenged his authority, and she had survived. She had shown him that she was not just a pawn in his game, that she had a will of her own, that she was a force to be reckoned with. She was a Romano, and she would not be broken. The cost was steep, but the glimmer of hope remained, buried beneath the layers of confinement and control. She would bide her time, waiting for another opportunity, another chance to reclaim her life, to secure a future for her child, a future free from the shadows of the Mafia. Chapter 19. A Shattered Reflection. The stricter confinement imposed on Alessandra was a stark contrast to her previous existence within the villa. She was moved to a smaller, more isolated room, devoid of any personal touches, any reminders of her former life. The windows were barred, the door was constantly guarded, and her access to the outside world was completely severed. She was a ghost, a shadow, her existence reduced to the bare minimum. She spent her days in a state of quiet despair, her mind replaying the events that had led to her current predicament. She grieved for Maria, for the informant, for the lives that had been lost, for the choices she had made, for the future she had lost. She felt the weight of her isolation, the crushing loneliness, the suffocating sense of being trapped. She also felt a deep sense of anger, a burning resentment towards Dario, towards the world he represented, towards the forces that had conspired to rob her of her freedom, her happiness, her hope. She hated him for his control, for his ruthlessness, for his betrayal of the fragile trust that had once existed between them. But amidst the despair and the anger, there was also a flicker of defiance, a stubborn refusal to be completely broken. She was a Romano, and she would not surrender. She would survive. She would endure. She would find a way to protect her child, to reclaim her life, to find some semblance of peace in this chaotic world. As her due date approached, her physical discomfort grew, adding to her emotional distress. She was constantly tired, her body aching, her movements restricted. She longed for the comfort of a familiar face, the support of a loving hand, the reassurance of a kind word. But she was alone, isolated, her only companion the growing life within her. One day, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a small, tarnished mirror that hung on the wall of her room. She barely recognized herself. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes were hollow and haunted, her hair was dull and lifeless. She looked like a ghost, a shadow of her former self. The shattered reflection staring back at her was a stark reminder of everything she had lost, of everything she had become. She was no longer the carefree, sheltered girl she had once been. She was no longer the defiant, rebellious woman who had challenged Dario's authority. She was a prisoner, a captive, a woman stripped of her identity, her freedom, her hope. She reached out and touched the cold glass of the mirror, her fingers tracing the outline of her face. She felt a surge of self-pity, a wave of despair so intense that it almost overwhelmed her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at the world, to break free from this suffocating confinement. But then, she felt a movement within her, a gentle kick, a reminder of the life she was carrying, the child who depended on her for survival. She placed her hand on her swollen belly, feeling the warmth, the vitality, the promise of new life. And in that moment, something shifted within her. She realized that she couldn't give in to despair, that she couldn't allow herself to be completely broken. She had to be strong, for her child, for herself. She had to find a way to survive, to endure, to reclaim some semblance of her former self. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and looked at her reflection again. She saw the sadness, the pain, the exhaustion, but she also saw something else. She saw a flicker of determination, a spark of resilience, a glimmer of hope. She was a mother, and she would protect her child, no matter the cost. She would find a way to navigate this new reality, to make the best of the hand she had been dealt. She would not be defined by her confinement, by her suffering, by her shattered reflection. She would be defined by her strength, by her courage, by her unwavering love for her child. She would find a way to rise above the ashes of her former life, to create a new future, a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a better tomorrow. The reflection was shattered, but the spirit within remained unbroken, ready to face the challenges ahead, to embrace the unknown, to fight for the life growing within her. Chapter 20. Redemption's Embrace. The labor pain started abruptly, a sharp, intense contraction that took Alessandra's breath away. She had been expecting them, preparing for them, but the reality was far more overwhelming than she had imagined. She cried out, her voice echoing in the small, confined room, her body racked with pain. The guards outside her door, alerted by her cries, rushed to summon help. Dario arrived within minutes, his face a mask of concern and something else. Something that looked like fear. He knelt beside her, taking her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle. "Alessandra," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What's happening?" "The baby," she gasped, her body convulsing with another contraction. "It's coming." Dario immediately took charge, barking orders to the guards, summoning a doctor, preparing for the arrival of his child. He stayed by Alessandra's side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, offering words of encouragement, his presence a strange mixture of authority and tenderness. The labor was long and arduous, stretching on for hours, Alessandra's body pushed to its limits. She endured the pain, the exhaustion, the fear, her mind focused on the life growing within her, the child who was about to enter the world. Dario never left her side. He held her, supported her, whispered words of encouragement, his presence a surprising source of comfort and strength. She saw a different side of him, a vulnerability, a tenderness, a genuine concern that she had never seen before. As the final moments approached, Alessandra felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to push, to bring her child into the world. She gathered all her remaining strength, focusing on the task at hand, ignoring the pain, the exhaustion, the fear. And then, with one final, powerful push, the baby was born. A cry filled the room, a loud, healthy wail that announced the arrival of new life, a new beginning. Alessandra looked down at her child, a beautiful baby boy, his face red and wrinkled, his eyes tightly closed. She felt a wave of overwhelming love wash over her, a fierce protectiveness, a sense of profound joy. Dario, too, was overcome with emotion. He looked at the baby, his eyes filled with tears, his expression a mixture of awe and wonder. He reached out and gently touched the baby's cheek, his fingers trembling. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Alessandra looked at Dario, seeing the raw, unfiltered emotion in his eyes, the vulnerability that he had always kept hidden. She saw a man transformed, a man softened by the arrival of his child, a man capable of love, of compassion, of redemption. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something more. Something that looked like love, a genuine, heartfelt love, stripped of all pretense, all power, all control. "Thank you, Alessandra," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for giving me this gift. For giving me him." In that moment, all the anger, all the resentment, all the pain that had existed between them seemed to fade away, replaced by a shared sense of wonder, a shared sense of hope, a shared sense of love for the child they had created. Dario reached out and took Alessandra's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I was wrong," he said, his voice filled with regret.
"About you."
"About Maria. About everything." He confessed that he had been blinded by his own fear, by his own need for control, that he had allowed his past to dictate his present, that he had failed to see the goodness, the strength, the love that existed within Alessandra. He asked for forgiveness, making a series of life-altering promises. He promised to get Maria freed, make a new life for her. He promised to raise his son differently, with love and compassion, not fear. "I want to be a better man, Alessandra," he said, his voice sincere. "For you, for our son, for our future." He told her about his conversation with Maria, that she had forgiven him. Alessandra looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, she wanted to trust him, but she also knew that the past could not be erased, that the scars would always remain. But in that moment, surrounded by the miracle of new life, by the promise of a different future, she chose to believe. She chose to forgive. She chose to embrace the possibility of redemption, of love, of a new beginning. "I forgive you, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "And I believe in you." They held each other, their tears mingling, their hearts united, their future uncertain, but filled with a newfound hope, a newfound love, a newfound understanding. The embrace of redemption was a powerful force, a transformative experience, a chance to rewrite their story, to create a new legacy, a legacy of love, of compassion, of forgiveness. The journey would be long, the challenges would be many, but they would face them together, united by the love for their child, by the hope for a better tomorrow. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the transformative power of love and forgiveness. Dario, true to his word, released Maria, providing her with a new life, far from the shadows of the mafia. He also began to distance himself from the more brutal aspects of his business, delegating authority to trusted lieutenants, focusing on legitimate enterprises, seeking a path towards a more peaceful, less violent existence. He proved to be a devoted father, doting on his son, Marco, showering him with affection, teaching him values of compassion, kindness, and respect. He also made a conscious effort to include Alessandra in all aspects of Marco's upbringing, respecting her opinions, valuing her input, creating a true partnership in raising their child. Alessandra, in turn, blossomed in her role as a mother. She found a sense of purpose and fulfillment in nurturing her son, guiding him, teaching him, watching him grow. She also rediscovered her own passions, her love for art, for literature, for life. She began to paint again, filling her canvases with vibrant colors, capturing the beauty of the world around her, expressing the emotions that had long been suppressed. The relationship between Alessandra and Dario evolved slowly, gradually, transforming from one of captive and captor to one of mutual respect, affection, and eventually, a deep and abiding love. They learned to trust each other, to communicate openly, to share their hopes and fears, to build a foundation of understanding and support. They never forgot the past, the pain, the betrayals, the scars that would always remain. But they chose to focus on the present, on the future, on the opportunity to create a different kind of life, a life filled with love, with peace, with the promise of a better tomorrow. They moved away from the villa, establishing a new home in the countryside, a sanctuary far from the dangers and temptations of the mafia world. They created a haven for their family, a place where Marco could grow up surrounded by nature, by beauty, by love. They often walked together in the gardens, hand in hand, watching Marco play, his laughter echoing through the air. They would reminisce about their past, about the challenges they had overcome, about the journey that had brought them together. One evening, as they sat on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Marco ran up to them, his eyes shining with excitement. He held up a small, delicate flower, a wildflower he had picked from the garden. "Look, Mama, Papa," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "A flower for you." Alessandra took the flower, her eyes filling with tears. It was a simple gesture, a small token of affection, but it represented everything they had achieved, everything they had overcome, everything they had built together. She looked at Dario, her heart overflowing with love. He smiled at her, his eyes reflecting the same deep affection, the same profound gratitude, the same unwavering commitment. "Thank you, my son," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's beautiful." They embraced, the three of them, a family united by love, by forgiveness, by the enduring power of the human spirit. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over their faces, illuminating their smiles, their tears, their hope for the future. They had found their redemption, their peace, their happiness, in the embrace of a love that had conquered all, a love that had blossomed amidst the shadows, a love that would endure for eternity. The end.